good evening. I'm Joanna Grab, and Jen will also be presenting, and then we'll have our whole team join. Earlier today, we talked about our study uncovering the true cost of passive house, and tonight we're going to talk about why we did the study. We'll briefly talk about our findings, and most importantly, we want you to contribute and to help the next generation of passive house projects get funding. So you can see on the screen there's all of our faces. We've brought together energy and finance from 4 separate organizations, and we added another group in, which we'll talk about at the end. So we've got Jamie Bemis and John Brayman from Bright Power. We've got myself and Scott Pusey from Stephen Winter Associates, and we're representing the energy side. And then really importantly, we don't always talk to the financing folks unless we want projects to get built. That's really important part of the equation. So having folks like Jen Leone from New York City, we call it HPD for short, and Talia Howe and Danielle Donnelly from CPC, the Community Preservation Corporation. So they were really critical in bringing these two sides together at a single table. So next up, the purpose of the study was how to underwrite affordable multifamily passive house buildings. We're all based in New York City, and that's where we see a lot of these types of projects going on. So we focused in on New York City projects, but I think a lot of the lessons apply to other places. Competitive funding applications often look favorably on passive house, but they rarely factor in utility cost savings when they're financing projects. This is really important and meaningful for passive house projects of all sizes, not just the big ones. Another question we wanted to know is how these multifamily passive house buildings are actually performing. We need data to verify this performance, and for the past several years, at least at every New York Passive House conference, we've been patiently waiting for the data. Now the New York City passive house multifamily projects are done with design, done with construction, and they're starting to be occupied, and we're getting like stable periods of occupancy. So now is time. We also wanted to merge this performance data with lender language. With buildings and operations, we can point to comparable completed passive house buildings, and this minimizes risk for lenders because they can point to successful examples. So why do we need lenders to understand passive house and vice versa? So lenders are excited about passive house, and some really just aren't. But what does that mean for your projects? CPC helped me understand the underwriting process. My background is definitely not in finance. But they broke it down really well with this graphic. With the same amount of income and lower utility bills, there's a greater net operating income. That's pretty straightforward math. But there's more to the equation, and it's really impactful. With this greater net income, the amount of public subsidy required to complete a financing package is reduced. So that means there's more money for more housing, since these passive house projects individually can rely less on public subsidies. Super important in New York City and many other places where affordable housing stock is lower than demand. So how do we collect data, and how can you do it? We have a broad definition of passive house. Not all early adopters certified, but we focused on a simple methodology. So we collected utility data. We started with a baseline of peers from recent code-built multifamily buildings. And we also identified passive house or passive house-like projects for comparison. The next step was to normalize and standardize. We used weather-normalized utility data and cost-normalized pricing, so we're comparing like things. And we also confirmed building characteristics like building gross square footage and mechanical systems. And then we compared using a bunch of different metrics. Honestly, we had so many early on in our conversations. We narrowed it down to 3 really important ones. These are EUI, greenhouse gas emissions, and then we also looked at the utility cost versus the maintenance and operations budget. We'll talk about those in a second. So back to the whole building site EUI, we used Bright Power's energy scorecards database to get all of these comparable buildings, which we call their baseline. So those are the two bars in gray. The far left one is pre-2003. The second in is the post-2003 multifamily buildings. You can see in the dark blue bars, there's two gas-heated passive house study buildings. And in the green bars, there's the electrically heated passive house study buildings. So these projects aren't all certified. That wasn't even the goal for all projects. They're all really high achievers that look to passive house for design inspiration at the very minimum. So we're comparing these to the passive house target bar in light blue on the far right. We know that it's impossible to define one passive house target for all of these different size projects. There's so many different characteristics that go into to that. We didn't differentiate PHI versus PS. We just wanted to look at a common factor. So this is just based on 25% gas and 75% electric fuel mix, and that's what we see in gas DHW and electric heated buildings. And obviously that there are a lot of other factors that play in. We looked at gross square footage for all of the projects, and we know that's a little bit different than how each of the programs operate. So not to get too deep into the details, but what is the graph telling us? It's telling us that performance isn't quite meeting that kind of modeled prediction, but these are all pioneers. I think they get a lot of credit for just trailblazing the multifamily market in New York City, and that they're approaching the model target. We're learning. We in the passive house multifamily community have been anticipating a performance gap, and here it is. So now we have a need for more data to better understand and reduce this gap, and having this gap as a starting point, and that's a big step for the industry. So next we'll look at greenhouse gas emissions and how they compare. Again, we've got our baselines in gray, our passive house study buildings in dark blue and green. And this graph shows performance in terms of greenhouse gas emissions per gross square foot. And this is pretty specific to New York City, but I think the lesson applies in a lot of places. So there's a local law 97, and there are certain factors that go into this equation for a 2030 emission cap. Eventually in 2050, there's another more stringent goal, but the good thing for the information we have today is that these buildings don't have to reinvest in 10 years down the line. That's really important for building owners to know and to understand. One other note, in New York City specifically, affordable housing is currently exempt from the local 97 caps, but the impact on these buildings the legislation may change in the city. So if carbon trading is available to affordable housing projects, that's a really huge benefit and advantage to passive house buildings. So I'm going to hand this over to Jen for more.
Well, you heard Joanna mention lender language, so I'm going to take over and talk about that a little bit more. So the third critical metric for us beyond EUI and greenhouse gas emissions was cost. This is what pulls it all together and makes it relevant to lenders and affordable housing providers. But we needed to figure out how to do this. It's not the most obvious way to analyze a project. There's so many variables. So we created a methodology here, which was to basically model each building in our study the way that it would be budgeted using the current maintenance and operation standards that we use at HPD. And these are published annually, and they look at heating and electricity on a per room basis and combined it with a utility allowance, which covers owner costs. So then we were able to look at all the buildings apples to apples. So what did we find? It's really challenging to draw conclusions from only 6 projects, but you can see in the charts that overall the case study projects are really compelling. They're performing really well, especially when you look at the fact that overall, on average, actual energy costs are less than half of what are projected. regardless of whether we're meeting the passive house targets or not. And as we mentioned, again, the cost savings are significant, which can unlock additional debt to support the project costs, but also reduce public subsidy. So what were our key takeaways and challenges? We just said it, the case study projects are definitely outperforming their peers in terms of all the metrics: energy use, greenhouse gas emissions, energy costs. The certified passive house projects and the electric heated projects are performing better. And size doesn't matter, but other factors like unit mix certainly do. We were also asked specifically for tonight to identify the biggest challenges. And we're not presenting a project, of course, but our biggest challenge is data. Data, 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 as they say. What we need is more data. We need more contextualized data so we can understand the data better. And we need more granularity on the data that we have. But the other thing we did learn is that this methodology is easily replicable once we have more data. We have a phase 2. This is a big thing, a big goal for us. We've only just begun this analysis. And our team is currently seeking funding so that we can go beyond and tie up some of these loose ends and get more information that's really critically needed for the passive house community and lenders in the passive house community. So there's 2 primary goals: an energy performance study, where we will get and look at more data, better data, and contextualized data, and also start to look at a better way to align the energy models with actual performance. And secondly, we need to address the underwriting piece of it. A really critical resource would be a comps database for passive house appraisers, for lenders, and anybody involved who's trying to underwrite to passive house savings. And that's going to require some more granularity on owner and tenant costs, more granular information on cost drivers, and also something we're very interested in are the non-cost benefits that we can factor into the underwriting and financing once we can quantify them better. And Joanna mentioned a little bit about carbon trading as one of these non-cost benefits. So how are we going to get there? Well, we're super lucky that we're working with a capstone team from the City College of New York's Sustainability in the Urban Environment program. And they are working with us to build a passive house survey and database. And a shout out to the team: Varsha Halarknar, sorry Varsha, I always mess up your name, Katie Cordial, and Lilibeth Liriano. And I think they're all here tonight, so cheers to them for helping us with this. And why is this survey so important? It's going to help us bridge the data gap and standardize the information in any sort of phase 2. And we think this will have significant benefits, not just to us, but the entire passive house community and lenders. So what kind of information are we collecting? We're collecting the exact kind of information we need to better assess the data and to further support the underwriting. So some of the key data points, and we're giving you a sneak peek of a survey that we think is really critical, and we're going to pass around a link to it for participation later. So some of the items on the survey include building size, use, and unit mix, building systems and metering, hard and soft costs as compared to your baseline costs, projected performance, and a request to share your data through Energy Star's free portfolio manager platform. And these are all really key pieces of information we need to take this analysis further. But also, I want to point out that this survey takes only about 10 minutes to fill out. And that's key because we think that'll help really encourage participation, which of course we'd love from anybody who has a multifamily passive house project in the works or completed that you're interested in sharing. So thank you so much for listening in. We're definitely going to leave everybody with a call to action. Like I said, if you have a project that you are interested in sharing with us, simply click this link and add your project to the database. Or if you're working on a similar data gathering exercise, we'd love to hear from you as well. And last thing, We're around to take some questions. We'd love to have a conversation with all of you. It's not just Joe and I, but it's Jamie from Bright Power and Danielle and Natalia from CPC are also here, and we're ready for a lively discussion. So cheers.